Welcome everyone to this webinar hosted by the SAHMRI, the South Australian Health and Medical Research Institute. I'm Michelle Browning and Ruby Nankivell is my co-facilitator. Here she is.
Hi.
Hi, and over the next hour, we'll be talking about the practice of supported decision-making. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. Now, SAHMRI have asked that we record the webinar tonight, and the video will be uploaded to their website. If you'd like to revisit this information or perhaps share it with others in the future, that's where you'll be able to find the recording of the webinar. And so throughout this webinar, we'll be keeping video and audio off for you as participants. So if you'd like to react to what Ruby and I are saying tonight, we'd love you to use the React tab up at the top of your screens. And also, please feel free to use the chat function as well. And Holly, our trusty assistant, will be monitoring the chat and will bring any issues that might come up to our attention. So before I go any further, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you tonight from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people, and Ruby is joining you from the lands of the Kaurna people, and we pay our respects to Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging. Now, the image on this slide that I'm showing now was created by an Aboriginal artist called Gertrude Hayden, who is based in Perth, and she was commissioned by Western Australian Individualised Services to visually represent supported decision-making. And I'd like to really read you Gertrude's explanation of this beautiful bit of art, because I think it's a lovely way to start to enter into thinking about supported decision-making. So Gertrude writes, "The spirits in the image represent individuals making decisions, with meeting circles behind them representing the supports that they choose to use, like family, friends, colleagues, or professionals. The branches and leaves show personal growth from being able to make your own decisions and choose your own path, while receiving support along the way, self-direction. The top and bottom meeting places represent support services, and the spirals leading out from these meeting places represent the road, path, journey that the individual will take when making decisions about their lives, after receiving advice and guidance from services or people they have chosen to help guide them in the direction they wish to go." So, what is supported decision-making that we're here to talk about tonight? Well, quite simply, it's really the process of providing practical assistance with decision-making. It offers people a broad range of supports to be able to make their own decisions and stay in control of their lives. But what do I mean when I say practical assistance? Well, I'd like to show you a really brief animation that I think gives lots of rich examples of how people can be helped with decision-making in practice.
What is supported decision-making? Supported decision-making is the process of providing practical assistance with decision-making to people who need support. So, what do we mean when we say practical assistance? Practical assistance can involve things like ensuring the person knows there's a decision to be made, explaining and clarifying information, and creating opportunities to try new things. It can involve helping the person identify and weigh up their options, solve problems, and minimise their stress and anxiety. Practical assistance can also involve identifying possible risks, developing an understanding of consequences, and helping the person implement their decision. For people with complex communication access needs, providing practical assistance can include other things like learning the person's unique language.
I noticed you're looking away and down. I think you're telling me that you don't like this bodyboard. Okay, now I see you're smiling and looking at the surfboard. I think you're telling me you want to try this board.
Practical assistance can also include acknowledging all the ways a person is communicating and acting on their expressions of preference, the things they like and don't like. These expressions of preference can be the basis of choices, which can be built into formal decisions. Supported decision-making includes reflecting on the decision that's been implemented.
So, while providing practical assistance with decision-making is very important, it's important that you realise that supported decision-making actually has a much bigger vision and ambition than just good decision support. From the very beginning in the early 1990s, advocates of supported decision-making in Canada wanted people with disability to be supported to control their own lives. But they knew that to be able to achieve that, they had to overcome the legal and practical barriers that stopped people with disability being seen as decision makers. These founding mothers and fathers of supported decision-making really wanted it to be a way of obtaining equal legal rights for people with disability in decision-making. So after starting in Canada in the early 1990s, supported decision-making was really introduced to the rest of the world at the drafting of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It was back in 2006 that United Nations delegates came together and were talking about people with disability having the right to equality before the law. And it was in this context that supported decision-making was raised as an alternative to substituted decision-making. So substituted decision-making is when someone else makes decisions on behalf of a person, and that can be informally or formally through the appointment of a guardian or a financial administrator. So Article 12 of the Convention, as it was finalised, says that governments really have an obligation now to provide people with disability with the support they need to be able to exercise their legal capacity. So in the same way a person with a physical disability may need a ramp to be able to access a building, a person with a cognitive disability may need support to be able to exercise their legal decision-making rights. So in 2008, when Australia signed up as a signatory to the convention, we really agreed as a country to provide people with disability with this kind of support to be able to exercise their legal capacity. So when we start to think about decision support as being a fundamental human right, it really shapes the gravity of the interactions that we have as health professionals. If we're not able to provide good decision support, you might actually be denying someone the opportunity to act as a legal citizen, not to mention reducing the extent to which that they can control their own lives. So we really have an obligation to provide practical assistance now in decision-making to enable people's right to autonomy, their right to self-determination, and their right to legal capacity. So when we're really trying to grasp the significance of the change in thinking that Article 12 of the Convention brought about, I think a really helpful illustration is the Copernicus Revolution. In 1514, Nicholas Copernicus, who was a mathematician and an astronomer, proposed a model that put the sun at the centre of the universe instead of the Earth. Now, the idea that the Earth was not the centre of the universe was so controversial, it was so radical that it sparked a revolution. And in the same way that Copernicus turned thinking about the universe upside down, supported decision-making turns substituted decision-making on its head. So if we're really wanting to embrace and champion supported decision-making in our work as health professionals, we really need to understand how and why it's different to substituted decision-making. We need to know what we're moving away from and why we're doing that. So this table that you can see on the screen is really summarises these key shifts in thinking that underscore the change from substituted decision-making to supported decision-making. So these key ideas are that rather than seeing people with disability as needing protection, we now see them as rights holders. People that were once denied their legal capacity on the basis of disability are now considered to have universal legal capacity. Supported decision-making says that we really all have the right to be seen as legal persons by the law, irrespective of whether or not we need support to be able to exercise our legal agency. Substituted decision-making requires a person's mental capacity to be assessed, but supported decision-making and that whole paradigm really makes capacity assessments redundant, because our starting belief is that a person's capacity is assumed. Decision-making ability we don't see as fixed in a supported decision-making paradigm, but we really see that capacity is developed, ability is developed over time or in different contexts. Decision-making capacity is not thought about as solely cognitive, but includes the supports and accommodations that we can provide to people during the decision-making process. So historically, substituted decision-making has really been guided by what is considered to be in the best interest of the person. But supported decision-making is guided by a new principle. It's really directed by the person's will and preferences. We're going to talk more about what that means soon. And lastly, substituted decision-making really sees decision-making as an independent process, whereas in a supported decision-making paradigm, we see decision-making as a shared interdependent process. Decisions can be made with support. So I guess as health professionals, some of these ideas might sit a little bit uncomfortably in the context in which you're working. You might currently be required to assess people's decision-making capacity as part of providing informed consent to medical treatment. So I think it's really important to realise that fundamental to being able to practice supported decision-making is thinking about decision-making capacity differently. Even in a legal context that really requires us to assess decision-making capacity, we can still be thinking about decision-making ability differently. So, supported decision-making really starts from an assumption of capacity. We assume people are capable of making decisions with the right support. And this approach sees a person's capacity as something that changes and can be developed, and decision-making as an interdependent shared process. The idea is that we all need support to make decisions at different times in our lives. And so it's appropriate to see decision-making as a more shared relational process. So if we want to embrace supported decision-making, we really need to start from a belief that different decision-making abilities that people bring to the process can be turned into decision-making capabilities with appropriate supports and accommodations. Supported decision-making can really distribute decision-making abilities required for competent decision-making across the decision-maker and his or her supporters. So if we're really wanting to see capacity in this new way, I think it can be really helpful for us to use a different term rather than trying to rethink and about how we change how we think about something that we've thought of in one way for a long time. I think sometimes it's easier to embrace a different term and use that moving forward. So I'd like to propose a new term for you to consider that is decision-making capability. And it's a formula. There's a formula here that was developed by two Canadians at the forefront of thinking around supported decision-making, Michael Bark and a lawyer named Lana Kurtzner. And when they were trying to clarify for legislators how would we talk about capacity in legislation and in policy in different contexts if we were going to not discriminate on the basis of disability. And they suggested this is how we can think about things differently, that we take the person's ability and to that we add supports and accommodations, and together those two things is what creates a person's decision-making capability. So why would we want to, I guess, adopt this new way of thinking about capacity? Well, I think as health professionals, if we adopt this way of thinking, it really changes the starting point of our interactions with people. We're not really leading with an assessment of deficits, so what it is that the person can't do. We're not looking for that. Instead, we're really starting from a place of identifying the abilities that the person has and then looking at what can be added to that in the form of supports and accommodations. So we really focus on what practical assistance is needed to be able to support the person to be able to make the decision. So taking this approach really allows us to find ways to make the environment more conducive to decision making. So we think about things like reducing background noise or increasing lighting, making lighting better, making sure that it's the right time of day that we're wanting to discuss really difficult, complex things with people that the decision involves. We also think about things like supporting communication in a better way. So we're looking at using different formats and ways of presenting information. We look at involving communication partners. We look at breaking down information into smaller chunks and giving people the time to process it. These are all forms of supports and accommodations that we can provide to people to assist in building their decision-making capability. We can also not just talk about options with people, but we can also help people to try things out, to be able to show us their preferences when they're not able to actually tell us what they want. So I think in time, our laws will change to reflect this more inclusive way of thinking about decision-making capacity. But until then, even when we're operating in contexts that require us to assess capacity, I still think that understanding that the support and the accommodations that we can provide to people change their decision-making capability is a very powerful idea. And I want you to, it really underscores the importance of your role, your professional role, and even in your personal lives, you'll be playing this role of decision supporter. It really validates and talks to the importance of you being able to provide good decision support because of the significant difference it can make in enabling someone to control their own life and also exercise their legal right as a decision maker. So one of these key shifts in thinking was thinking about capacity differently. Well, another one that I talked about in that table is what guides the process of decision making. So substituted decision making is guided by what we understand to be in the person's best interest, but supported decision making is guided by the will and preferences of the person making the decision. So will and preferences are often still part of substituted decision making. What is it that the person is saying that they want? But it's only one of many factors that gets weighed up in the decision-making process by a substituted decision maker. Whereas within the supported decision-making paradigm, the person's will and preferences are the centre of that kind of complete centre, the sun of that decision-making universe. So as supporters, our responsiveness to and the way that we respect what it is that people say they want when they express their will and preferences to us, that is by acting on those, that is how we ensure that people remain in control of their decision making. When you help someone to explore what they want in light of the options, in light of any barriers that they may or may not be aware of, that you assist them to understand. When we explore potential risks and possible consequences, by doing all of these things, you're actually assisting people to their will and preferences to become informed throughout that process. So I think it's important to explore, what do I mean when I talk about this idea of will and preferences? Well, I think we really express our will and preferences all the time in living our lives. Will and preferences spark our actions and our nonverbal communication, as well as the goals and the desires that are important to us. Our will is what drives us and gives our life meaning. It is our deeply held beliefs, values, and commitments. Sometimes we may not know or be able to tell people what our will is, but if we watch people and how they live their lives and the actions that they take, this is perhaps the best way for us to really understand what a person's will is. Our preferences, on the other hand, are things that are important to us in the moment. They're our likes and dislikes. We can show our preferences in very different ways, or show our preference differently in different situations. So I can say that I love something, or I can show you what I like by laughing, nodding my head, crying out. These are all ways in which I can express my preferences. So some people may have difficulty really expressing their true will and preferences. They may have experienced chronic low expectations from others, or they may have experienced trauma in their life that makes it or that means that they require significant support to be able to and encouragement to be able to express what it is that they really want to health professionals. People may not have had their will and preferences respected, and that can lead to disempowerment, fear, apathy, and disconnection. It can also lead to frustration and anger and an unwillingness to collaborate with people that they don't perceive are respecting their will and preferences. Some people with psychosocial disability may express preferences when they're unwell that are at odds with their will and the broader vision that they have for their life. For example, someone may say they want to spend all their money on something that they have little use for. So let's say they say they want a boat when they live in a landlocked city. And in doing that, it would really leave them unable to pay their rent and at risk of homelessness. So in this case, they really may need the support of trusted people in their life to be able to make sense of the misalignment between their will to have stable accommodation and their immediate preference to buy a boat. So this idea of will and preferences and us helping people to clarify, express and clarify their will and preferences in the context of a specific decision opportunity is central to our role as decision supporters. So how can we improve people's ability to tell us what it is that they want, to be able to express their true will and preferences, given that sometimes it's not necessarily an easy thing to do? And I think perhaps the most powerful way that we can do that is by strengthening the quality of our relationships with people that we're supporting. By communicating respectfully and honestly and positively, we can build trust with people. And even in very brief interactions, that can make all the difference in terms of somebody being able to really express their will and preference to us. My doctoral research and many other pieces of research into the practice of supported decision-making has really identified that quality support relationships are the foundation of good decision support being able to be provided. And quality support relationships are things like, or how we know we have a quality relationship is if we see trust in that relationship, if there is respect, if there's knowledge of the person and knowledge sometimes of one another, and equality. So if equality is the foundation of the relationship, then we have a base upon which we can provide good decision support. And it's in that context that we can talk about options and risks and possible consequences with people in a really fruitful way. But if we don't have that kind of quality of relationship, it's problematic. So I recognise that this can be really challenging for health professionals that work in fast-paced environments that may treat people for only a very short period of time in their life. So how do we develop this type of quality relationship? Well, I think in that context, it's really important that you think about collaborating, because we need to really be able to collaborate with people who know the person that is making the decision well, people that they trust, who know the support that the person requires to be able to communicate their preferences effectively. We really want to collaborate with these people, because I guess when we understand the importance of relationships, it means that we understand that we need to ask for it. We might decide, well, we need then to ensure when we make appointments, we ask that a trusted supporter comes with the person to be able to provide the context within which an important decision might need to be made. Another option is, a way in which we can strengthen relationships or respect the importance of the quality of the support relationship. It might mean that you provide people with information in one meeting with them, in one consultation, and then you allow the person to go away with that information and to discuss that information with someone that they trust, that knows how to help them process that information and weigh up their decision. And then they return to you at a later time to be able to really communicate their final decision with you. So you all might have some other ideas about creative ways as health professionals that you can, I guess, get around this dilemma of relationship and how important it is to be able to provide good support, and yet you're working in such contexts that are so time limited and under stress. So I'd be very interested to read comments in the chat if you have some ideas around other ways you might think about using time and your efforts to further how we can strengthen relationships. So the other another element or strategy I think that's really useful for you as health professionals is having a framework, an understanding of the key elements of what a good decision-making process involves. So when you're working as health professionals, you're likely to wear a number of different hats in relation to providing support. Sometimes your role might be to provide people with information relevant to a decision, and that it's not you that's the primary decision supporter. A family member is the person that's going to see the person through this process and journey of kind of weighing up their options and reaching a decision. But it might be that there are times when you're assisting someone and really there's no one else that's able to provide the person with decision support. And so you become the primary supporter by proxy. And in other contexts, you might identify someone is making a decision, but they don't actually have the support around them that they need to be able to work through this process well. And so you might use your knowledge of good supported decision-making practice to advocate for the person to get the support or the time that they might need to be able to be well supported to make an informed decision. So in kind of whatever context you might be coming to this idea of a process of supported decision making, I think it's really useful for you to have an awareness of what these 6 key elements of a good supported decision making process are. So it starts with looking into and understanding the decision, and it's kind of an unusual thing. Perhaps it sounds strange, but you would be surprised how often it is not actually that clear and self-evident that a decision needs to be made. And part of our role as a decision supporter can be really making sure that people are aware that there is a decision to be made. The second key element of a supported decision-making process is really seeking to understand the person's will and preferences in relation to that specific decision opportunity. We help people to gather information and explore their options. And we obviously want to explore options that are guided by what we know of the person's will and preferences. So already what we know of the person and what it is that they're wanting really informs and shapes the information we explore and the options that we seek out for the person in the decision-making process. Next, we work through barriers and risks. and benefits as well, really. So we're really helping people to weigh up those different elements and understand all of the factors that are shaping their decision, the options that are available, and what might happen in the future for them. So when we explore risk in a supported decision-making context, we take a risk enablement approach, and that's something that is very important to know, but we don't have the time to really explore that tonight. But I encourage you to really learn more about risk enablement. And we help people to weigh all these options up, weigh up the barriers and risks and the options in making the decision. And then lastly, we always reflect on the decision and what happens for the person. So I think there are lots of potential benefits to using this kind of structured approach to decision making. While it's not the way we naturally make decisions, we don't naturally follow a process, I think there are lots of benefits to doing this, especially in a professional context. So I think it can really help us when we're collaborating with others. So if you are supporting someone in the context of many different people in their life that are involved in a complex decision, then having a common language and a common set of principles to follow can be really useful. I think it can also be used to help educate others about good decision-making processes. So going through that process with family and informal supporters can be really useful in building their capability. It also encourages us to be more intentional and creative when we're doing things like exploring options and helping people try things out. I think it can also give us greater confidence that we've heard a person's decision, especially when they don't use words to communicate, because it really encourages us to check and recheck our interpretation with the person and with others in their life that know them well. And lastly, I think following a process can really help us identify what's worked and what hasn't worked for the person, whether the outcome has been successful, and whether further actions such as advocacy or another decision-making process might be needed. So I think there's lots of benefits. So if you want to dive a bit deeper into the process, I really recommend this resource that's been produced by Belonging Matters. There's a link to this resource in the digital resource summary that I will send out to you tomorrow morning. And it has a list of questions. So that process is outlined within this document, and there's a set of questions that can guide you through each of those elements in some more detail that I think is really useful and practical. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is stop sharing my screen, because what I'd like to do is introduce my co-facilitator to you. I'd like to invite Ruby Nankivell to share with you her experiences being supported to make decisions by health professionals. And she's also going to share her advice that for you to consider when you're supporting people with disability in the future. Ruby is a person who has Williams syndrome and is an inclusion advisor at SASID, the South Australian Council for Intellectual Disability. She runs her own business and she enjoys public speaking about the importance of good decision support, amongst other things. And I know that you'll really enjoy learning from her, as I have. So welcome, Ruby.
Oh, thank you, Michelle. You're so sweet.
So tell us about a good experience that you've had when you've been in hospital and been supported by health professionals to make some decisions in hospital.
Yes, so hi everyone, my name is Ruby. I've had lived experience of being in and out of hospital, more than I would like to be honest, not fun when you end up not well. I'd say my good experiences when I went to hospital and I was in horrible pain, I didn't feel well, and the hospital got to me real quick. So the nurses and doctors came and talked to me and got me in real quick and made me feel included and important, and asked all the questions of like, why are you here? What happened? Have you been here before? So they were asking a lot of questions that helped. They did a lot of tests. So they did a ultrasound and contrast in the tummy. So they put dye in your tummy to have a look at everything in your tummy to have a look to see if they could work out why I wasn't feeling very well. And they also explained about painkillers, so medication that I could take that could help me. They did warn me that some may make you feel a bit sick because they may be, really strong. But overall, it was a very good experience because they put me first. They listened to me, my concerns, and they just made me feel a bit more calmer in that moment. And I felt more supported. So I felt like I could make the right decision for myself, and having support from my family helped too.
Wonderful. Oh, that sounds brilliant. Okay, so perhaps could you tell us now about an experience where you didn't receive the support that you would have really liked when you were in hospital?
So one time I went to hospital and I was very sick, and the nurses and doctors decided to talk in front of my room and not really to me about what was going on, and they just kept kind of looking at me. For me, I found that kind of rude because I was like, I want to be a part of the decision. I don't know what they're thinking. So it was like a lot of emotions for me, and it was hard for me to cope with. And it would have been better if they just listened and cared for me a bit more. I would have liked that.
Yeah.
Just to be a part of it because it's my health. So I wanted to be included. And then one time they wanted to move me to another room, and I didn't know where I was going. So I rang my mum to say, I'm in the hospital. They're moving my bed. I have no idea where I'm going. So mum asked them if they could just wait, until she got there because she was supporting me. They said no, so I had to ring her and tell her that they're about to move me any minute, Mum. You need to come in now. And Mum advocated for me and asked, where's Ruby going and who she's going to be with. And I was going to be in a room with people who were mentally unwell. So they said there was one person who had a bodyguard, one person who was screaming, one person who was going crazy. And my mum just said, I'm sorry, but that's not appropriate for my daughter, because she had to speak up for me because I was so sick. I couldn't even talk or, advocate for myself, which was really emotionally sad and hard. That was very emotionally tough. But I was thankful that I had someone advocate for me, like my mum, and someone was there for me. And so they decided after a while to keep me in that room, which was really great because, my mum advocated and said, I'm sorry, but this is not appropriate. My daughter's not been well. She needs to get better. So I'm glad that my mum did that. And I just hope that people have that in hospitals, have someone who can speak up for them, because I had that, but maybe not many other people might have that experience. And I do public speaking about disability and lived experience because I want to make a change in the world. And Michelle knows this, but I'm also engaged, which is really exciting as well. And I do have Williams syndrome.
Congratulations. We're
Thank
all
you.
very excited about your engagement.
Thank you.
What I would love you to do, just before we wrap up, I would love you to share your advice. So what advice do you have for the health professionals that are here listening tonight when they're helping other people to make decisions that have a disability, perhaps an intellectual disability like you? What advice would you give them? What could they do that would be helpful?
I think just treat us the way that we want to be treated, because the way you treat us is the way we'll treat you. You know what I'm saying? So treat us with respect, support, kindness, understanding, accept us for who we are, and help us when we need it the most, because we're not asking for a lot. We're just asking for acceptance and a bit of help, bit of support, bit of love, a bit of care. So just people listening, talking to us, supporting us if we're scared, if we're frightened, and just help us through whatever we're going through at that time, because we need it the most to get through it.
Are there things around communication when people are talking to you that make things easier for you when you're making decisions?
Communicate with those people with disabilities in the hospitals. Talk to them like Michelle is with me. So she's communicating with me. So easy information, like easy read is really good.
Yep.
And just easy sentences instead of long sentences for medical
Yep.
words as well. And just, yeah, you know, being there for us, talk to us, help us understand more if we're confused or we don't quite understand what we're going through. And yeah, definitely around decision making, help us to make the right decision for our health, but for ourselves too. So it's all those, you know, things.
Absolutely. Oh, well, look, thank you so much, Ruby, for sharing your experiences and your insights with us. I particularly liked your advice around not using big words. I think that's quite important because I think there'll be health professionals here tonight that have done lots of training at university, and they learn really specific words to talk about things.
I struggle with medical words.
Yeah,
you know
look,
what
it's
I mean?
really
Like
hard.
medical words for me are really hard. I need them to be shown so that I can understand them more. Because if they're long, I go, sorry, but I don't get that. Like, I don't quite understand.
I think sometimes as well, when you're a professional, sometimes you use big words without even realizing you're doing it. So I think this is just a really great reminder of how important it is to try and simplify what we say when we talk to people, because it's always helpful to do that. Well, thank you so much, Ruby. We really appreciate hearing from you tonight.
I hope that helped everybody. And and thank you. And the last thing I would say is that the hospital gave me a lot of empathy that helped me through my experience of what I was going through. Because that also made me feel like I wasn't alone. That made me feel included. So that's my story. And thank you all so much. And thank you all. And hope you enjoy your night. And that's it from me about decision making. And go decision making and go everybody. It's good. Keep doing it. Good luck.
Thank you so much, Ruby. Well, there's one more idea. There's a strategy that I want to leave you with tonight before we end this webinar. So I'll share my screen one more time. And it's this idea of minimizing our influence. So this is an important strategy for any decision supporter, no matter what our role, whether we're a health professional or a family member or anyone else. If we're supporting someone to make decisions, this principle, this strategy of minimizing our influence is really foundational to being able to provide good decision support. So there's three things, three ways that we can minimize our influence, and I'm wanting to share those briefly with you tonight so that you can take those away with you when you're going to the office tomorrow and hopefully perhaps even put them into practice. So the first way in which we can minimize our influence is to try and provide support in a way that is neutral. So we don't want to be aligned with any particular option, position, or outcome as a supporter. So I think a helpful analogy might be to think of ourselves as Switzerland, that impartial land in Europe. So it's not easy to be Switzerland, though, because we all come to decision making with biases. So what are biases? Well, I think some common examples that we might have when we're acting as a decision supporter is believing that we know best is one bias. Another is having a strong preference regarding the options that the person's considering. Another is being directly impacted by the decision. Having values that are aligned, very aligned or very misaligned with the decision maker is a bias, and also having a very specific vision or expectations for the decision maker and their life. So all of these things are biases that we can bring. There are many more that we can bring to the decision-making process, and they can really colour the way that we provide information and talk about options. And we're really wanting to make sure that we're approaching providing decision support in a really neutral, non-judgmental way. Okay, so how else can we go about minimizing our influence as a decision supporter? Well, I think the second way is by acknowledging our biases, acknowledging that we all have them, acknowledging that we bring them to the decision-making process. And then once we know that they're there, we have to work to minimize their impact on the decision maker and their decision-making process. So I want to read you a couple of quotes from my doctoral research. There was a mum and a professional supporter who I interviewed, who, as part of my research, she told me, I think it is an art in many ways. She was talking about supported decision making, because to do it in a truly authentic way, you present the information, you don't present your opinion on the information. And that is really hard to do when people feel strongly about information, or if you are connected to the person strongly. And then she went on to say, I mean, I could probably support your young adult with supported decision making better than I could support my own kids, because I have desired outcomes for them that colour how I present information. And I think that's natural for any parent, whether your child has disabilities or not. I also think you could, as a health professional, you could say health professionals feel very strongly about information, and that equally can present challenges as well. So then Lydia went on to share an example of how she'd gone about mitigating her biases when she was working with a specific group of self-advocates. She said, when I supported some self-advocates during a political process, and there were some pretty heated discussions, and I had some pretty strong opinions on them, and I had warned them ahead of time. I said, look, we're going to be talking about this, and I have an opinion on that, and I don't want my opinion to colour yours. And what I would like to do is to bring someone in who doesn't share my opinion, so that you are hearing from both of us what the pros and cons are around the issue. So if we want to really minimize our influence as a supporter, we need to take a neutral approach to providing support, and we need to work to really acknowledge our biases, name them, and then do what we can to mitigate their impact. So that might be by bringing in someone else who doesn't share our views, ensuring that other perspectives are also made available to the person making the decision. Now, the third way in which we can minimize our influence is to ensure that when we help someone make a decision, we're focused on engaging in a good process rather than achieving a specific outcome. I call this the process, not outcomes principle. So another aspect of my doctoral research really found that if a supporter focused on a specific outcome when they were providing decision support, what often happened was that they ended up informally coercing the person, or actually being involved in undue influence during the decision-making process. So supporters were fundamentally unable to accept what it is that the person was saying that they wanted, their will and preferences, until they changed and aligned with what they thought the right action was. So in these situations, supporter used lots of different strategies, lots of ways of trying to get the person to change their mind. Sometimes they would use lots of encouragement to get them to change their perspective. Sometimes they present an idea as if it came from the person, as if it was really their idea, what they were presenting. Sometimes they'd bargain, they'd offer rewards, they'd link an activity to something that they knew the person really wanted to do or really enjoyed. And by doing that, they were trying to kind of reward them making a certain choice or decision. There were also times when supporters used anger. They used threats to try and change the person's will and preferences. They also intentionally changed or withheld information from the person during the decision-making process. So we need to be aware, I think, of the impact that we're having when we're supporting people to make decisions. We want to give people more agency and control, not less. And I think to do that, we really need to approach the decision-making process from this neutral standpoint. We need to acknowledge and work to minimise our biases, and we need to focus on engaging in a good process rather than achieving any specific outcome. So What I'd like to do, because we just have a few minutes now, is to ask you to engage in a little reflective exercise, because an important part of supported decision making, or important strategy that supporters use and have at their disposal, is being reflective. And I know all of you in your different health roles as health professionals already engage in reflective practice in what you're doing. So I just want to use that and to help you spend just a couple of minutes thinking about whether you've actually been trying to influence people's decisions in your role as a health professional. I'd like you to think about a time when you helped someone make a decision. And I'd like you to think honestly, and you're not going to share this reflection with anyone else. So were you trying to influence the person's decision? I'd like you to sit and try and identify what were the biases that you had when you approached that decision-making process. What did you bring to that decision-making process? So when we talked about biases, some examples that you might come to mind might be that you thought the person was too unwell to decide. So I think that was in Ruby's story when she shared about the second story that wasn't a good one when she was in hospital. I think assumptions were made there that she wasn't well enough to decide, and so she was excluded from important conversations about where she was going to be in hospital. Another assumption might be that an option is too risky, or that you value safety more than personal autonomy. So the way that you're shaping and framing information changes as a result of that value, strong value that you bring to the decision-making process. And lastly, the third thing I'd like you to think about is whether you were approaching the process with a specific outcome in mind. Did you come to the process feeling that one option was really the right one, or did you come to the process needing the person to agree to something because of the context of the decision in the environment where you work? So I'd like you to just take a couple of minutes and sit with that to reflect on your own influence as a professional. So I think if any of you have had an insight that you would feel comfortable and like to share, please add something to the chat, because I'd be interested to see if that was meaningful or useful as an exercise for you. But I guess what I'd like to do is just conclude tonight by saying that I really hope that you're leaving this webinar tonight feeling inspired to want to be a better decision supporter. I think being able to provide good decision support is so important. I think it will really make all the difference in terms of whether or not the people that you are supporting remain in control of their lives and whether they're able to exercise their legal decision-making rights. So today we've really explored the benefits of using a framework. I've put a framework to you that might help guide how you provide decision support in your role as health professionals. And we've also talked about the importance of assuming capability, starting from that assumption of ability and building on what it is that the person brings and providing supports and accommodations that really create a person's decision-making capability. And we also talked about always working to minimise our influence as supporters. And we talked about 3 ways that we could do that: by having a neutral standpoint, by acknowledging our biases and working to mitigate their influence and the impact they have. And lastly, focusing on a good process rather than achieving any specific outcome. If we can have that distance, then it allows people to really genuinely express their will and preference and not have it coerced or shaped in some way. So we hope that, Ruby and I are really hoping that the information we provided tonight really makes you want to learn more about supported decision making. And tonight was really just an introduction. So if you're wanting to learn more, we hope that you really enjoy exploring the digital resource summary that we'll email you tomorrow. There's a wealth of information there, videos and articles and things that I think you would find really useful. And I guess Ruby and I just want to wish each and every one of you every success in taking these ideas and using that in the important work that you do as healthcare professionals. Thank you so much for your time and attention tonight. And I really hope that our paths might cross again in the future. So,
thank you guys so much. And Michelle, shout out to you as well. Thank you guys so much for tonight. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed it and get something out of it.